It's always a pleasure to introduce someone who you know and in whom you have a great deal of confidence. So I'm really delighted to be able to say a couple of words of introduction for Makoto Fujimura. I first met Mako quite a few years ago when a graduate of our art department living in New York City suggested that I should get to know this Christian artist who was beginning to make a mark in the gallery scene there. Mako met me at a sandwich shop in the Tribeca area, and at that lunch, I began to get to know a fascinating artist, a dedicated entrepreneur, and a sincere Christian eagerly anticipating the kingdom of heaven. I have since made an introduction to Mako, his artwork, and his work with the international arts movement a standard feature of my senior capstone course for studio art majors and community art majors. I don't want any art student to leave Wheaton without learning about Makoto Fujimura. Mako is a master steward of God's gracious gifts of creative, social, and monetary capital. He's deeply invested in the history and future of artistic culture, and he is a generous collaborator in the work of cultural renewal and transformation. You have to follow Mako's website. You have to read his meditations on culture called Refractions. You have to look at his paintings, and you have to interact with the many facets of creative life fostered and supported by the international arts movement. When you do, you'll realize that Mako's value to the world is not only in the things that he has made, but in the model that he is for the work that still has to be done. That is, for the work that you and I have to do. So, high praise to you, organizers of Missions in Focus, for having the good sense to bring Mako to this conference. And great thanks to you, Mako, for coming. We look forward with great anticipation to your words. Makoto Fujimura.
Well, I'm deeply honored to be here with you this morning and to be part of this series of discussions and thought process of how you might journey into the world. And I got here yesterday, spent the afternoon looking at Sadao Watanabe's work across at the Billy Graham Center there. I had the privilege of writing in the catalog for this Japanese artist's work. I hope you will see the exhibit before it leaves in March. And I had many thoughts going through, looking at the artwork. Many of the things that I want to share with you this morning, how you might engage with culture or art. Now, I don't know how many hands will be raised if I ask you, are you an artist this morning? But I can tell you for sure that if I asked in the same number of kindergarteners, it would be far more hands going up. I'm convinced that something happens in third grade. Someone tells us that we're not good enough, that you don't draw things this way, or you don't play the piano a certain way. And we stop from being these curious creatures full of energy, of creative voice that God has already instilled in us, and we moved into this cold and gray world of pragmatism. Now, there's nothing wrong with pragmatism. It gave us technology and science and refrigerators. But what I call the single most toxic element of culture that is dehumanizing us is what I call utilitarian pragmatism that is so pervasive in every sphere, not just in the church, but in the government, in every institution, even the art world. And this utilitarian pragmatism typically goes like this. You have an exhibit, you have a theater, and that's something really nice to have if you have extra money and in your budget. And surely we appreciate beauty and we appreciate good music and dance and theater, but it's really not our bottom line, is it, in this society? That's the first thing that gets cut. And I have, as an artist, journeyed in this river full of these decision-making. I've spent 6.5 years in Washington, D.C., helping with National Endowment for the Arts and traveling all over the country, and sometimes it's being sent to the world to really reflect on this. In fact, my book, Refractions, comes out of that experience, and I decided to write about it during the time that I'm waiting for planes to arrive or to leave, and it became a book. C.S. Lewis, in one of his most important books, and it is not Narnia, in a book called An Experiment in Criticism, which to me is one of his most important books, says this about art appreciation. He says, "We sit down before the picture in order to have something done to us, not that we may do things with it. The first demand of any work of art makes upon us is to surrender. Look, listen, receive. Get yourself out of the way." So while I'm walking around Watanabe's pieces, I'm thinking about this. What does it mean to surrender? Look, listen. A friend of mine, Bruce Herman, said this once in reflection of this passage by C.S. Lewis. He said, in order to understand something, you have to be willing to stand under it. You can't come in with your ideologies and the particular premises or presuppositions that you bring into something and you stand over it and pretend like you understand something. Most of us have a way of using this utility, and we're influenced by this utilitarian pragmatic culture that says in order for something to be good, it has to be useful. It has to be useful to me, it has to be useful to my ideologies, whatever I believe, the systems of faith, and it has to be a tool for evangelism, a tool for discipleship. And artists like me, who usually sit in the back of churches, way back, like back there, because I'm such an introvert, and I end up in oftentimes churches just intuiting the language of our churches today. And I'm trying to be part of it, sincerely, and I am a leader. So therefore, I am forced upon these occasions where I do get to speak into that body of Christ. And the thing that I struggle the most, the language, the culture, this utilitarian pragmatism that I struggle with, is that I am only good if I'm useful. So you can say that your art is wonderful because it's useful to the church. You can say that my life is useful because it's a useful tool for discipleship, but I kind of get really defensive at that point because I'm not a machine. I'm not a cog in this large machinery that has been built over modernist experiment. I'm a human being. You cannot use the arts any more than you can use a human being. We're not utilitarian beings. We are beings made in the image of God, and God cares about this. So when we encounter the Bible, and I have been meditating on this passage in Mark 4 and several other Gospels about the nature of the soil. And let me just read this passage to you, Mark 4, 1 through 9. Very quickly, it's going to be a very cursory look at this passage, but I want to impress upon you the connection between what I just said as an artist, this plight of an artist, the struggle, okay, and your reality as Christians or maybe people struggling with faith, walking into this wildly pluralistic world today. I want to connect the dots here. Mark 4. Again, Jesus began to teach by the lake. The crowd that gathered around him was so large that he got into a boat and sat in it out on the lake, while all the people were along the shore at the water's edge. He taught them many things by parables. And in this teaching said, listen, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and a bird came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among the thorns, which grew up and choked the plants, so that they did not bear grain. Still other seed fell on good soil. It came up, grew, and produced a crop, multiplying 30, 60, and even 100 times. Why does Jesus speak in parables? Why not tell us straight? Without this language of creating an intentional veil around this truth which he's trying to communicate, came to be that truth. And as an artist, this language that Jesus speaks is home to me. I love reading this passage because he's out by the lake, okay? He's going to the beach, trying to run away from people. I understand that. I'm an introvert. And then he has to speak because people follow him. And he doesn't talk about the ocean. He doesn't talk about the beach. He starts talking about farmers. I love that. There's a disconnect here, right? And parables are intentionally creating the space between what you think the person is going to say and what happens, the stories that come out of a person, the art, the music. It seems a little bit obscure. So you wonder why he speaks this way. And when C.S. Lewis says, get out of the way of trying to understand something, that applies not only to art, but it profoundly affects how you understand the gospel. So, as I have gone on in my journey, I have realized something. That the way I read my Bible, I thought I was reading it in a way that was a little bit slanted because I'm an artist. But I began to understand that the thing that I struggle with, the utilitarian pragmatism, the toxic culture that we live in, which is shallow and rocky and full of thorns, I have realized that the concern that I have about the reality of the church, reality of Christian education, reality of my own journey, It's not about art at all. It's about the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's all about Jesus. And this parable, I've heard it preached many times. You know, this parable is used as a way to talk about evangelism. We are to scatter seeds as much as possible, so widely. You've heard this, right? In mission conferences. And you should expect things to go wrong, that there are 1/3 that rejects it, the 1/3 that takes it, but it's shallow, so it doesn't last. Persecution and difficulties come, and the person runs away. But you and I should be this good soil. You've heard this message. I've heard it. But I don't think this passage is talking about that. I'm not saying it's wrong to use it in that way, but it's typical utilitarian pragmatism at work. This passage is about the soil. It's all about the soil. And I actually think it's about the soil culture. I actually think that between nature and culture, there is no difference. So when you think about environmental stewardship, I immediately think of cultural stewardship. So the dots that I'm connecting, however oblique it may sound to you right now, there is this reality, profound connection between the struggle that I have as an artist and the struggles that you will go through as a Christian in this world. And the struggle, furthermore, the struggle that you would have as a human being in this fantastic, pluralistic, but dehumanized world. And art, what it does is brings that element of humanity in a moment when you need it the most. You will hear a song, you will see a dance, or you see a theater production that actually articulates everything that you have been struggling with, that you are trying to deny and suppress. And the soil which we have created, especially in evangelical cultures, I must say, just as much as New York City is a rocky and thorn-infested ground. It's hard to say this, but the soil is, our soil of the church is not ready to receive the gospel. We're not ready. You know, Tim Keller, my pastor, Redeemer Church in New York City, when he speaks to pastors, he speaks as you can imagine, many settings. But I heard him say this several times. When he has pastors in front of him, he says, "How much of the gospel do you understand?" And the pastor is sitting there thinking, "Well, I'm a pastor, you know. I have to say like 80%, you know, maybe 90, maybe 100%, you know, maybe I understand the gospel. I have to preach that, right?" You know what Tim says? He says, "I think I understand 8% of the gospel." Well, if Tim Keller understands 8% of the gospel, I think I understand 0.00008%. Maybe less. Do you understand the gospel? Have you stood under it? If you think you understand, it's probably a good sign that you don't. Recently, I moved out to Princeton. I lived for 15 years in New York City. I was actually a ground zero resident, raised my kids there. And my wife and I decided to move out, start a new journey. So for the first time, I'm living an agrarian life. We bought this farmland, and I'll end with a story. And so I'm tilling the soil, right, to get ready for the summer, and spring is here, and I'm making the soil work, and I didn't know much about it, so I started reading. I started to talk to farmers, and I wanted to find out as much as I can, and it struck me that experience of trying to be a farmer was far more instructive to me of understanding this parable than anything else. There are two things that are critical to understand this parable in Mark 4. One is that you understand what it's like being a farmer, and the other is that you understand poetry. And so I began to think about this, and as I was cultivating the soil, right? I'm picking the soil up in my hands, and I realized something. I had this revelation. You know what a soil is? Soil is layers and layers of death. Things that are decaying and composting, things that we don't like to think about. And this parable opened up to me. Oh, that's what Jesus is talking about. It's about the soil. It's about the stuff that we like to avoid talking about in our churches. It's about death. It's about failures. It's about things going really wrong. It's about the ground zero conditions of our lives, the ashes that we walk on. It's about the mistakes that you've made. It's about the failures of friendships and loves. It's about all these things that make up this cultural soil, and we do the best we can to avoid it. But artists do not. They're the ones who point the way, uncomfortably so, for the rest of us. They transgress against this utilitarian, pragmatic world and say, no, I am a human being, and I see things that are dark and things that are wrong with this picture. And I think the reason why you need artists of faith in this conversation is because that artist of faith is perhaps the only source that you can go to where the soil, that layers and layers of dead things, is good news. It doesn't end in despair, but it ends with that good seed being sown on the good soil, and the seed takes root deeply into the cultural soil. And when I realized that, I realized my work as an artist is like a farmer. It's to till the soil, even when the winter is coming, to prepare the soil. Even when things do go terribly wrong, like on the days of Sandy struck New York City, our world, I lost 35 pieces. It's small compared to what others lost. Or like Bruce Herman losing his entire studio in one horrible summer day in a fire. When these things happen, when you lose a loved one, when you struggle with illness yourself, remember that God can raise you through that darkness, and the imperishable seed will be sown in your lives so that you can come to life again. Let me pray. Father, we pray for these young lives, that you would cultivate the soil and make it rich, deep, and diverse, so that your seed can land and take root deep and deep and yet deeper. Father, that you would do your work, even in this place, that you would start this work that will last 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. And the seed sown will be manifested in the culture at large. Father, I pray and commit these students to you and faculty here at Wheaton, that this will be a place of authenticity, this will be a place of wrestling, that these difficult things, the dark moments, will come to be part of our conversation. And art can lead the way. Pray in Jesus' name. Amen.